Welcome. My name is Brutus T. Titweiler, and we'd like to welcome you to the nightly Titweiler Report. The show that brings you, the viewer, the good news, the positive, inspiring message that, even should you at times feel as though other people are smarter than you are, and that life may be passing you by, tut-tut, or as we like to say, tit-tit, here on the Titweiler Report. Tut-tut, have not another care, not so long as the churches still drag them in, and they continue to include instructions with condoms. Now that I've said that, wait a minute. Did it ever frighten you? If you're ever having some sort of misgivings about just the ordinary intelligence of humanity, has anybody ever really threatened to go get a condom and look at the instructions? Like start talking, one, unzip your pants. I'm sure that all right-thinking, decent people don't even want to. We were, if you recall last time mentioning how it would be that a real Euro-revolutionist, in a certain way, if we called it working for a kind of freedom, it would only be struggling for a kind of freedom that would actually be possible in some way. And for it to be possible in some way, the possibility inside of a finite landscape would have to be here, and it would have to be now, as opposed to the ordinary nervous system's dreams as it comes out inwards, that any dream of freedom, that is, dream of change, dream of some improvement in yourself, always, whether it be a split second ahead of where your nervous system is, which the nervous system, this end, is always a split second behind as fast as it works. It's why you can't ever get revenge good. You remember that old one, when the truck goes by and the guys throw out the beer can and hollers, "Screw you, fatso," and you got something even more intelligent to reply, it's too late. You remember that one. That's an old Kyrootian physical law, that the nervous system is the last to know. This end we're talking about, of course. The other end is the first to know. But if there was some sort of freedom possible, then a neuro-revolutionist would only be struggling for that which might be possible, and that would only be on the basis that it would have to be in the here and it would have to be in the now, as opposed to in my dreams somewhere up the line. Yeah, in a second. Yeah, this is my last drink. Hey, no more for me. I've had enough. I'm cutting down. Whether it be that or I'll do it next week. It's always in my dreams tomorrow. So as opposed to that, and how sort of where we left, I wanted to pick it up, was that one reason that a real neuro-revolutionist, anybody who might, let's just say, what do we say? Anybody that really understood anything would know this, that back at the ordinary level at which the mind operates, all this question about freedom is a waste of time anyway, because in a finite world, there is no such thing as freedom. And that's where we left off. Colon. So I was going to ask you to consider this. Remember where we just left. At least I didn't emphasize anything enough. That in truth, in a finite world, there is no such thing as reality, as freedom. So if you'd consider it this way, on that basis, that there is no freedom, taking that as an operational given to start with, there is no freedom in a finite world, then the fact that all polar-based thinking produces, creates, and supports a finite intellectual world. It is this, as always, serves as a self-defense, strikingly fortified kind of merry-go-round. I don't mean the kind just with cheap plaster horses. It would be the kind that looked like that they had worked from some of the original operational embattlement plans of Leonardo Was that too much? It looked like a stealth merry-go-round. Or it looked like a merry-go-round produced by McDonnell Douglas. Or, do you understand? It would be like a merry-go-round, armor-plated, with turrets and rocket launchers and all sorts of armaments coming out of every opening. All right, we'll try it this way. Man's ordinary, man's natural, and man's proper world would consist of this. It would be one with a non-free primary realm and one with a secondary that can dream of an otherwise. That is not only, it's not just self-protection, whether anybody got anything out of my picturization of an armored merry-go-round or not. It's not just for the sake of self-protection, because any form of self-protection is also a form of growth. And it's not just some cheap, you got to admit it was cheap, picturization of a merry-go-round as being some sort of useless moot act. It just goes round and round and goes nowhere, and so what would be the stake in fortifying it anyway? That's not it, because if anything is protective, if anything is circling back on itself in the finite world, it's not just holding the status quo, it is growing. Of course, then you've got to say at a finite level, all views of growth are subject to great interpretation. But at any rate, it is not simply a stagnant situation, because in a finite landscape, if a merry-go-round's running, at least you got something. It's not like you're staying there looking at a rock grow. What you have got with man and the idea of freedom is, without any doubt, anybody can understand and agree, that you have, in what we've been referring to as the double realms of the primary and the secondary, you have an absolutely incontrovertible, proper, sane, reasonable primary world of non-freedom, not even the dream of it. Because you had a dream of non-primary freedom, you are, by everyone else, by the collective definition, you're nuts. Because you'd be the kind of person who would get up on top of a building and say, I do not believe, personally, in the laws of gravity. As you begin to flap your arms, giving those about you a pretty good indication of where this is going. There is no such thing as freedom in a primary world. Now, everybody agrees to that, if you're sane. There's things you cannot do. You cannot cut your throat and wear a nice new necktie without getting it soiled. You cannot kill yourself and continue to live. How about that? So what you have in a proper world for man is you have a primary world without any question of freedom. It is simply a non-free primary world, combined with a secondary that can dream of the otherwise. This is how it operates of that which seemed to not be running very smoothly where I started it, pointing out that if you start with the given, which you should be able to, or just start with it until you see it, that there is no freedom in a finite landscape. And that polarized thinking here polar-based thinking produces a finite intellectual landscape. It's not open to question. It's not to say, well, something's amiss. Anything that is polar-based, anything that is based upon the two choices, whether it be here or somewhere else, but here's where we're pointing to now, it will produce a finite landscape. It cannot be otherwise. It cannot be otherwise verbally, and it cannot be otherwise on the reality of the energy that produces the verbal description. So to say that there is no freedom in a finite world is not some sort of theory. It is not a hypothesis if you see that the ordinary mind in you, that anything that it thinks produces its own finite landscape. Or else it would not make sense. It would not be alive. It could not operate. It could not even say up is up. It could not turn a lock by inserting a key. It could not drive a car. You could not stand up. If it was not on the basis of you continually, you do it at the primary physical level without intending to, without any thought. You are operating on the basis of a polarized finite world, or you wouldn't do anything. You wouldn't eat, you wouldn't stand up, you wouldn't lay down, you couldn't. But then what is not seen, because the secondary, that is, the intellectual world of man, is arranged in such a way as to dream otherwise, by being able to dream that I am not in a finite landscape, it produces a finite landscape. Well, should we go back to the Titweiler report? I'm going to pretend to change the subject, but let me just remind you. Everybody can see that at what we're calling the primary level, and you could just call it the physical level, at that level, there is no such thing as freedom. I mean, it's not worth talking about. You can only eat certain foods. You can only live within the perimeters of certain humidity, temperature. The physical demands of you and every other sentient creature on this planet lives within such specific confines that any question of freedom is just a waste of time. You've got to be hard up for a hobby to say, well, I bet I could eat a little arsenic. The idea of freedom is just useless. It is just moot. It is irrelevant at that level. But combined with that, to be a human, to be a fully functioning human, then you've got to have the secondary, or the intellectual world, that must be able to dream, or for those of you out in TV land, must be able to think. Otherwise, so if you will put your own semicolon there, we'll pretend to change the subject, sort of. Just some more general headings under the idea of freedom and the idea of someone attempting to do that which might be possible. Keeping in mind that you and I have already agreed, or you convinced me, that at a certain finite level, which is where the ordinary intellect works, there is no such thing as freedom. It's just you can mentally say to yourself, screw all ideas, if you ever had them anyway or worried about it, of philosophical notions of freedom or religious ideas of free will. All you've got to do is have some notion, as the dog did when the man said, no, you don't have to get up every time I come over. And the dog said, hey, tell that to my genes. Don't you understand that? Wait a minute, no wonder I like a dog. No wonder I like my pet beaver. I mean, it's good for a person to have some sort of intellectual peerage. Sir Beaver. Well, we're back in that general area. Let's try several other things, sort of having changed the subject. It would only be a neural revolutionist. It would only be somebody that had some part of their brain active that's new. It would only be this kind of neural revolutionist that would try to get the better of himself. If you recall, again, the story of the warrior seeing the leash around his neck and telling the aide, if the hand at the other end of that leash is not mine, shoot me, which absolutely belies our already agreement tonight that there is no such thing as freedom in a finite world, so a man's hand can't be at the other end of the leash. He cannot be controlling himself. Or if the hand is on the other end of the leash, if we're going to beat the damn picture and parable to death, if it is on the other hand of the leash, he can't do anything by his hand anyway. So why does he turn to somebody else and saying, hey, if I can't control what I'm doing, as captive as I am, if it turns out that I am not my captor, shoot me. What if the aide picks up a gun, and the guy says, and the king says, or the warrior says, wait, I'm not sure that I actually meant that. And his aide says, hey, tell that to my genes. It would only be a neural revolutionist pressing along. The Titweiler report has only limited access to this particular time slot. It would only be a neural revolutionist who would try to get the better of himself. as impossible as that may be, would try to get the better of himself and then move on to a new neural or new nervous system address and never think to mention his old one, much less to badmouth it. Did someone ring the cannon tonight? All right, it would only be the neural revolutionist. I'm just going on. Enough of trying to be nice and reflective and thoughtful and concerned about the audience's reaction. Remember, there's some realities that Kyroots point out that do not like to be talked about. I fear that some of you are unknowingly, unwittingly in their employ tonight. Need I remind you of the final part of that Kyroot about those realities that do not care to be talked about? You already forgotten? Next item then. It would only be the neural revolutionist that could change and then deny it. Well, at least if questioned. That is, at least he would refuse to acknowledge that he had changed for any of the reasons that the questionnaire might bring up. Well, in your stupor, would anyone care to consider the possibility that I'm not talking about a neural revolutionist, some guy dressed up like a metaphysical Bruce Lee, which I guess would be a pretty shoddy sight to see by now. But we're not talking about a revolutionist over here, some guy. We're talking about something that all this is in here. And we're not talking about that there's a revolutionist somewhere, this great warrior. John Wayne made up to look like Genghis Khan, which I was looking for a silly picturization that suddenly came to me that actually happened. And I assume some of you have seen the movie, if indeed it qualifies as a movie. But it's not that there's some warrior out here and that suddenly some Philistine-based reporter, some nosy peon, comes up and wants to question the man. Whereas you can imagine, Buddhas and great Vishnus and Vishnus and all sorts of wise, strong people throughout history, and then these little gnats flying around the great elephant's knees and saying, "Oh, tell us so and so, tell it." You just picture a big old elephant that looks sort of like a combination of John Wayne and an elephant and Bruce Lee. Will not lower itself to answer. Screw all that. What if it's here? And now back to what I said, would only be a neural revolutionist. That is, some part of your brain, not somebody else, that could change and refuse to admit it. And I'm not even going to imagine that your interesting level of alertness tonight would even cause any of you to say, "Jesus, that doesn't make any sense. Why would a man change and refuse to admit it?" That, in case you nodded along with that, unbeknowingly, I'll admit I surprised you, that is the stupid test for the night. Why would a man change and then refuse to admit it if questioned? Well, back to your own nervous system, if I must point out the obvious, which comes along with, it's one of the prizes with the rest of the food, with the treat. A man's ordinary nervous system could not do otherwise. If a man he doesn't even have to actually have change, since we already admitted that there is no freedom at the ordinary level and a man doesn't actually change. We already know that. But an ordinary man, as you know from your own, your own past thinking, that people imagine they've changed. Oh, if you really pressed them, they'd say, "Well, now I can't tell you I've absolutely changed, but I'm planning to." Which is the same thing. That is all ordinary people do, is plan to change. You recall that is how the city in one way operates, that it can take busy streets running through it. That is the neural lines of communication here, but a city can take the streets and take the busy traffic and take the noise of the traffic as being proof of the importance of the commerce. Well, could we improve upon one of our great past philosophers? Not just I think, therefore I am. I hear noises up here, so it must be important. I hear movement on the floor above. You don't really have to know what they're doing this time of night. At least they're up. They're up and about, so at least they're not a bunch of dunderheads. They're not drunk and passed out. No, something's going on. I hear the noise. You can be ordinary and take that as proof, which is the same thing as a man. That get too even obscure for us. It's like the great Owen, I'll make it more obscure. That you can say that, you've quit drinking, well, you got to drink in your hand if you know how to do it. That is, all you got to do is be ordinary. It's not a trick to say, well, if you know how to do it, it's really that you've got to be able to do it and not ever think about it or ever question it, and then you're good and ordinary. Then you can stand there, for instance, be having a drink or having a cigarette, and somebody say, I thought you quit smoking. You say, yeah, I did. I got to admit, you got to be really good and ordinary. And very few ordinary people can do that, but it can be done. That is, yeah, I've changed. And if you're ordinary, in responding to that, somebody, you'd say, well, it doesn't seem so to me. I mean, you said you quit drinking, you got a drink in your hand. Do you see me drinking right this second? Well, no. No, well, what's it to you? All right, now back, forget two guys standing at a bar. Now back to you. Yes, I feel guilty about so-and-so. Well, God, I should stop. That is almost at a finite level. And almost is not the word, but I'm trying to get your attention a little bit. It's almost the same thing as having stopped whatever it was you felt guilty about. That, well, I should change, as long as you're talking to yourself. And it apparently is some, at that moment, impressive movement of energy. Well, yeah, I should stop. That it just seems reasonable to you that the man's smoking and he just spit up blood again. He goes, I should quit. With an ordinary nervous system, that is, I'm going to say very close. Because in a finite world, we can't explain this. If that's the only way you can hear it, because I can say very close, because if I tried to tell you the truth, it's more insane than trying to be nice about it. How can you be more abstruse than abstruse? I do not know. But somebody that says, all right, I'm going to change. That is almost the same thing as change. This is not to attack ordinary people. This is not to say, well, people have no willpower, people have no gumption. Do people have gumption in the 90s anymore? It's not to say that. And you don't have to look at other people and say, well, people lie to themselves. Or I assume that you've never been bitten by a bat that was rabid from reading Freud and think, well, people say that and they just delude themselves. No. Look at yourself. How have you stayed relatively sane all these years at the old level? And the way you do it is why it gets reflected in psychological jargon about people deluding themselves and people projecting their own weaknesses and having other people's weakness projected on them and all that kind of stuff. Because there's reality to it. It is that the nervous system can say, once this energy reaches the verbal level, which if you're secondary, it's got to, one way or the other, it comes, and you can say, all right, I'm going to change. And somebody else, that is part of your own nervous system, if it was pointed out, can go, well, you say that and you haven't. If it was not what I'm telling you, that saying you're going to change is, quote, again, almost the same as change, everyone would be certifiable. That's old 50s or 60s talk. If you don't know, that means that you would be certifiably insane. Just look, because it's not an attack on humanity to say, well, people say they'll change. Because if you're an ordinary person listening to this, you could say, well, the example you made is really sickening, if not silly, to say that there a man stands smoking, he's been coughing up blood, doctors say he's going to die, and you say, geez, Hubert, I wish you'd quit smoking, we're concerned about you. And he says, I'm going to. You say, well, you keep saying that. I am. No, first thing tomorrow. I just already had this one lit. And people think, well, you're just lying to yourself. God, you're breaking our heart. All right, now forget all that and it's inside. If that was not the way humanity is, everybody would be nuts. You'd die from being nuts before you'd die from lung cancer. You couldn't live in the secondary world unless, what I'm telling you, although it's not literally true, but you can't describe it otherwise in a finite landscape, if it were not the fact that saying you're going to change, that is believing that freedom, yes, is possible, while knowing it's not. Yes, freedom is possible. While knowing it's not. But yes, freedom is possible so long as it's the dreams of freedom tomorrow. That is what keeps the human nervous system alive at the secondary level. That's what keeps the machinery rolling. You follow. It's back where we started, trick. That no, there is no such thing as freedom at the primary level. If there was, it would be suicidal. So there is no such thing as freedom at the primary level. But then at the secondary level, is there any? Should we save time and say, in your dreams again? Nah, there seems to be. But what if there's not? Just for the sake of a little argument, sub rosa. Let's assume that even at the secondary, even here, let's just assume, just as a joke, that there is none. Look what happens, though. All sane people believe otherwise. I mean, all sane people throughout history. You could take all of the great thinkers and stinkers of the world in history, and they would agree that, what they could say to us, what you're calling the primary world, there is no freedom. I mean, that's ridiculous to talk about. But when we get into the domain, into the realm in which man becomes singular, then it is not so simple a matter that there is a certain kind of freedom, because you can think what you want to, you can try to exercise your free will, you can try to go against bad habits, you can try in some way to exorcise some of the psychological idée fixes, which that's the plural. Of course, if you got a good idée fixe, you don't need a plural. One good one will sustain a man usually most of his life. But then if we went a little further, if I could get an ordinary person to say, don't lose your place, if I could get them to say, wait a minute, and I could prove it if they'd listen for a second, and they can believe that, wait a minute, you're right, there is really no freedom at the secondary level. Now, if you did that, you would have killed somebody, if you could do it. You would have grabbed their nervous system up here where it's still alive, and you would have strangled it, literally, which you can't normally do. Well, life works out because those who know how to do it wouldn't try to do it to anybody else. People try to do it to each other, but it's just two drunks dancing together. It's two people spitting up blood and smoking in each other's face. Because there are people in life that tell other people, no, there is no freedom of will. No, you can't change. Men and women pick on each other. Friends pick on each other. Family, they'll tell people, you're a dumb mother and you'll always be a dumb mother. You're no good and all that. And what they're doing is saying at the secondary level, there is no such thing as freedom. You cannot change. And so it doesn't work. You understand? That does not drive ordinary people insane. They do not go, you're right. It doesn't kill them. They just turn around and say, same to you. It's that sort of thing. But if I could get an ordinary person, just follow what I'm saying, if I took an ordinary person and made them momentarily see that not only is there really no freedom, it's not what we're talking about at the primary level, the physical, animal level, not only that, but hey, you're right, there may not be any here. They would then, just a split second, if I give them to see it, which the only reason I bring it up is to get you to see that that's the way the mind wants to run, if they saw it just for a second, it's no good, because then you're back to, I'll work on that tomorrow. That is weird and astounding. But I'm glad he brought that up because I never thought about it. This may be finally the impetus for me to write my great novel. This gives me something to go on. Do you hear? Because rather than it being a matter of homicide, that one person, me saying that we do that to somebody, rather than having committed mayhem, metaphorically speaking, on their brain, on their nervous system, they could go, if they saw it just for a second, wait a minute, there may not be the kind of freedom I always imagined at the intellectual level. God, I need to write this down. What kind of novel or play that would make? Do you hear? Because as long as the mind can operate that way, even at the secondary level, the idea of freedom, let's assume for 1 second, there is no freedom at the secondary. Let's just assume that just for the sake of this. If that were true, it doesn't matter. Not as long as you don't have to face it. Now, at the primary level, you got to face it. Back to being sane and getting through your 60 or 70 years. You cannot avoid facing the lack of freedom at the primary level, or you would eat arsenic. You would go and climb in a furnace when you got cold and try to sleep. So you got to face it. But at the secondary level, what I want you to see in the secondary realm, there could still be no freedom. But you don't have to face it. May I refer you to a Kyroot from the last time we met that really drew a blank with people. That pointed out that if you don't know what I can't quote it exactly, if you don't know what a Orthodox, I think it was Reform, Orthodox, non-union, neo-modernist dentist looks like, you can speak about him with impunity. If you, in the secondary world, if you do not have to face the fact that there is no freedom, then who can tell you there is no freedom? Because you can almost take somebody and run their face up to it. That's why I said that I could almost get an ordinary mind to go, wait a minute, there could be some truth to that. But when you're based on polar-based energy and it runs right up there, it's like suddenly get up to a mirror and you go, because there's always a way out. Because you always see you and you go, no. Because even if you say, wait a minute, I'm almost on the verge, for a second, it made me think that there may not be any intellectual freedom. But wait a minute, you got a pen? I'll have to think about that. You're all right. Polar-based thinking will always produce its own finite landscape. And in a finite landscape, there is no freedom. But since the intellect has produced its own, it cannot look in a mirror and say there is nothing in that mirror. Well, sure there is. What the hell do you think you're looking at? Oh, that's me. If the ordinary mind could say that, it would look in a mirror and see nothing. On that resounding